Welcome to the program, to Law Easy. My name is Martin Schenkman, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Jonathan Blotmacher. And we're going to talk about the most popular common estate planning tool, spousal lifetime access trusts. And specifically, we're going to address an issue that's been raised by some commentators as to whether or not these techniques work at all. And we're going to conclude they can. General disclaimer, please keep in mind that this presentation and all the materials on Law Easy are for educational purposes only. Do not take any legal, tax, or other action without consulting appropriate professional advisors. Jonathan, just 30-second quickie. Just tell everybody for to make sure they're all on the same field what a SLAT is and why so many people are doing them.
Well, a SLAT is a spousal lifetime access trust. It's where a married person creates a trust for the benefit of his or her spouse, and it's made so it does not qualify for the marital deduction, which means it's going to be a completed gift, and the exemption will be used, except to the extent that maybe you can slip in something for the annual exclusion, and it will not be included in the estate of the spouse for whom it's created. And very often the spouses basically create one for each other.
And the key to why these are so popular is the exemption right now is a whopping over 12 million. It's going to close to 13 million next year, but it gets cut in half in 2026. And even apart from that, I think everybody's uncomfortable with relying on whatever may change in Washington. So why not do your planning now while you can? And the other advantage of SLATs is that because spouses are named as beneficiary, and there's lots of different variants, which is not our topic today, they can get access to the money. So you can use your exemption and gain access. Now, of late, there's been a number of a couple, not too many, I don't think, commentators that have been attacking this technique and trying to undermine what I would say most estate planners in the country are pretty routinely doing. Jonathan, real quickly, why don't you summarize some of the attacks that these folks have been suggesting make SLATs not work?
Well, the first is the so-called reciprocal trust doctrine, which is a doctrine that's not only arisen in the tax law, but has actually arisen with respect to creditors' rights, where I create a trust for one person, and that person then creates a trust for me. And the courts, in many, many circumstances, will go ahead and uncross them. So I'm treated as though I created the trust for my own benefit, and the person who created the trust for me is treated as basically he created the trust that I created for him or her by himself or herself. Therefore, you can have estate tax inclusion, and also under the law of many states, even if interests are discretionary, they will be subject to the claims of creditors. The second doctrine that's sometimes used is it's all a sham, or there was an implied agreement between the spouses and their trustees that the trust I create for my wife would really benefit me in the long run, and the trust that my wife creates for me would basically be for her benefit. And that's kind of an implied agreement, or almost a sham transaction. It's not what it appears to be, it's something different. And finally, it's a little bit of, well, it's just too good to be true. You created this trust for your spouse has created one for you. You guys are basically in the same economic position that you were before you created the trust. And therefore, we're going to not regard the form of the transaction and say that basically the trust for your benefit you created for yourself.
One of the things that concerns me about some of these recent articles, and I'll call them attacks on SLATs, is you could write something to be helpful to those people trying to use exemption, right? Super wealthy people worth hundreds of millions of dollars and up, they don't need a SLAT. They can set up trusts for just beneficiaries like children or other heirs. They don't need to include these powers. It's the more, and I hate the word moderate in this context because they're pretty wealthy people, but it's people in the, call it maybe 10 to 30, $40 million range where this becomes critical because they're trying to get the planning that more wealthy people are doing, but they can't afford to do it and not have some means to access it because they may need money in the future. And I think it's unfortunate the tone of these attacks. It could be done from the perspective of, hey, there are risks, which everybody knows, and here's some ways to enhance the likelihood of success. I think it could be done constructively rather than destructively. But it seems that in our current environment, people like to draw negative attention to things. Let me address what I think is one really easy way to enhance the potential for success of a SLAT. And I think, Jonathan, you and I both agree that if properly done and properly implemented, there's certainly no guarantee, but should be a decent chance that these will succeed. One of the issues that Jonathan mentioned is an implied agreement or a sham. I like, wherever possible, to use institutional trustees because you can't really have an implied agreement with an independent corporate or institutional professional trustee. It's just not going to happen. And I think that's one way to deflect it. The other thing that I think is a real issue is where I think the IRS is going to attack these transactions is the same theory they attack lots of transactions when they're not administered properly. There was a landmark case, I'll call it landmark, called Smaldino last year, in which the IRS hammered a taxpayer on a transaction just because they did so many things incorrectly. Anyone doing this kind of planning, do it right. Meet with your advisors regularly. Maintain the plan. Make sure it makes sense. Try to deal with it properly. Jonathan, what about the some of the other things that we can use to make these work, such as adapt jurisdiction, but most important, the powers, the differences between each trust?
Well, you try to make as many differences as you can. A difference in time, a difference in the assets that are added to the trust, a difference of the interests of the spouses in the trust make all the difference in the world in having a successful one. For example, I created a SLAT for my wife, and some months later, actually, it was the next year, I went to her and I said, "Would you like to create a trust for me? You don't have to." And there had been no discussion with her ahead of time that that would happen, but she did. In addition, my wife had tremendous powers in the trust. The trustee could give her entitlement to all the income. She had a lifetime special power of appointment. She had a testamentary power of appointment. The trustee could give her funds for any reason or no reason at all, and she could remove and replace trustees anytime she wished. The trust that my wife created for me, I was only a discretionary beneficiary, and I can only receive a distribution after 5 years. Up until the end of that 5 year period, only our descendants were beneficiaries. The standard, by the way, when I did become a beneficiary, was under health, education, maintenance, support. And I had no power of appointment. I had no power to remove and replace trustees. And also, one of the other things that can be done, and Marty, you have pointed out, create your two trusts in two different jurisdictions. So they're subject to two different state laws. And that's another big difference you want. Make them as different as you can possibly can, which means you want to create these early as you possibly can and not wait until the last minute when everybody will panic and say, I've got to do something to use the exemption.
Just one last comment because we're pretty much out of time. Um, when I read the seminal case, the Grace case, to me, the focus is that the parties are not in the same economic position. I think the kind of differences Jonathan said, and I don't know that you necessarily need all of those, but obviously the more you do, the better. But um, do make differences to the parties. And I think that's really key. I can see issues where spouses, especially in second and third and fourth marriages, are very concerned when they realize that these differences that are baked into these trusts really do have substantive impact on the economics to each of them. Um, and just in fairness to everyone, in 2020 and 2021, when the government was proposing really harsh and dramatic tax law changes, people had a plan quickly before those laws were enacted, and they didn't have the luxury of time. Right now, we have until the end of 2025 before the exemption is to decrease. We have time to be able to separate these in different tax years and with time between them. At any rate, Jonathan, thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. Please keep in mind that the video clips are for educational purposes only. Thank you.